This morning we have a missionary with us, Kirstin Edinger. And Kirstin is just ready in about 2.5 weeks.
3 weeks from tomorrow.
3 weeks from tomorrow to depart overseas. And so we're going to hear her story this morning, and I hear some of what God is speaking to her heart and where she is going. But when we partner with missionaries, when we partner with Kirstin, we are partaking in the Great Commission. We are participating in the Great Commission when we give to missions. It is something that we are making an intentional decision to do. It's something that we may be sacrificing money that we could spend somewhere else. And when we do so, we are participating in taking the gospel all the way around the world through people who have been specially called to leave their home, to leave their families, to leave everything that they know and travel somewhere at the call of the Lord. So if we could welcome Kirstin forward, and she's going to share the word with us this morning.
Good morning. How are y'all doing today? It's a beautiful day out there. Finally got some sunshine. I just drove in yesterday from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where my parents live, and they had about 6 inches of snow on the ground when I left. So I was very excited to get down here and see that there was no snow. It's like, hallelujah. Not ready for it yet. Now, when I introduce myself to people and I say, hi, my name's Kirstin Edinger, and they're like, oh, what do you do? And I say, I'm a missionary. It's always fun to see the reactions on their faces. For some, it's like, oh, that's interesting. And some it's, oh, that's interesting. And sometimes they just turn around and walk away because they think that you're going to try to convert them and baptize them and everything on the spot. But but being a missionary it's even me personally, before I came into missions, I had no idea that this is the direction that my life was going to take. For so many years, I was actually headed in a completely different direction, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. But when the opportunity came for me where I really felt like God was telling me to take the next step in my faith and draw a little bit closer to Him, I had no idea that was going to lead me into missions. And so what I'm trying to say is, as a missionary, there is no cookie cutter missionary. Each missionary that you meet has a specific call on their life that God has placed, a vision that God has placed in their hearts to take to a specific part of the world, or maybe it's just a specific skill set that is more applicable to certain parts of the world than others. And yet this is something that God has placed on their hearts because of their love for people and because of their love for Him, that He has sent them to different parts of the world. And for some missionaries, that may mean planting a church, and some missionaries that they may be a pastor, or they may be going to a specific place to start an orphanage or a feeding program or something working with kids. And yet, for me personally, this all came about through my love for disaster relief, my heart for disaster relief. And that doesn't, when you think of disaster relief, you don't necessarily think missions. And yet, going through a really difficult time in my life after I had lost a number of friends in complete freak accident and related to a natural disaster, I became almost obsessed with disaster response. Whenever there was a disaster somewhere around the world, I was volunteering for any team that I could get on to go over there and help. I just love to help people. And if somebody asked me what my mission is, I would tell you that God has placed it on my heart that my mission as a missionary is to help people. I love to help people. And how I've been doing that over the last few years has been through working with Convoy of Hope Europe out of Brussels, Belgium. For the last 4 years, I've been serving as a missionary associate in Brussels, Belgium, working with Convoy of Hope Europe. My background is in operations. I actually spent a lot of time working for the military, working in Washington, D.C., and in Cincinnati, Ohio, just down the road a little bit. And through that time, when you're not necessarily thinking that you have a skill set that can particularly be used for the gospel, it's amazing to see how God brings things around full circle and how He can use the skill sets that we have. And so for me, it was using my operational experience with an organization that did disaster response all over the world. But in addition to the disaster response that Convoy of Hope Europe has been doing, they also do a lot of community development work. And when I share with people, once again, that I'm a missionary, I've been working with Convoy of Hope, and we do community development. One of the things a lot of people ask, what does community development mean? What does that actually look like? And so this morning I want to share with you a story in the Bible that really, to me, explains the heart of what community development looks like. And the amazing thing about this is these principles of community development that I'm going to share with you this morning, they are just as applicable here in Bellevue, Ohio, as they are in Tallinn, Estonia, which is where I'm going to be going in 3 weeks from tomorrow. And we've seen these principles work in Moldova, we've seen them work in Russia, we've seen them work in South America, we've seen them work in so many places around the world because the principles are so basic that they can be tailor-made and tailored to a specific community to see how God can work miracles in the lives of the people and transform entire communities through his power and his love. And so if you'll turn with me, we're going to start in 2 Kings, the book of 2 Kings chapter 4. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 7. It's the story of the widow with the oil. And some of you may be familiar with this story. And I personally had heard this story so many times throughout my life. I was thankfully raised in a Christian household. And even though when I left that Christian household, when I graduated from high school and I started college and moved out on my own, I kind of decided to go in a different direction. And I spent about a decade of my life not necessarily following the will of God. But thankfully, he brought me back into his kingdom. And so just a couple months ago, when I was reading this story again, when you start to read the story, you're like, okay, I know this story. And yet this specific time when I was reading it, I felt like God was like hammering in my head. He's like, no, look at what's really here. And so if we'll read verses 1 through 7 together, verse 1 says, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha saying, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves. So Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil. Then Elisha said, go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all of your neighbors, empty vessels, do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all of those vessels and set aside the full ones. So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who had brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass when the vessels were full that she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another vessel. So the oil ceased. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest. Now, once again, if you've heard this story, it's an absolute miracle that God, she has just, all she has is a little bit of oil. And yet, as she starts to pour that little bit of oil into these empty jugs, empty vessels, the oil just keeps pouring, and it never runs out. And it's just so special because, God very obviously worked a miracle in that situation. And the amazing thing about it is God continues to work miracles in our lives around the world, very obvious miracles in our lives every day, as long as we're looking for them. If we're keeping our eyes open to what he's doing around us, it's very easy to see the miracles that he's working in our lives every day. And so when I was reading this story, one of the first things that I took away from it was everyone has gifts. God sees value and potential in what we may deem insignificant. Here you have a widow. She just lost her husband. They're in so much debt that the creditors are actually going to take her sons and sell them to be slaves to pay off that debt. And so she's absolutely desperate. I'm sure any mother would be if she's grieving the loss of her husband, and now she's about to lose her sons as well, and they're going to be consigned to a life of slavery. And yet, in her desperation, she sees Elisha, and she reaches out to Elisha, and she says, you have to help me because they're about to take my sons because we're in so much debt. And Elisha, instead of saying, okay, here's a check, pay off your debt, he doesn't do that. What does he ask her? He says, what do you have? And so immediately, the thing that jumped out at me when I was reading this story was that Elisha was not just looking to fix the problem. He got her involved in her solution. He looked at her and he said, what do you have? He saw value where she didn't see value. She said, all I have is a little bit of oil. And any of us in that same situation might have thought, well, That's not going to get you anywhere. What could you possibly do with a little bit of oil? And yet through that little bit of oil, because Elisha was so in tune with the heart of God and God's heart for this woman and her sons in this situation, Elisha saw the potential in that little bit of oil, just like God sees the potential in each and every one of us. We each have skills. We each have abilities. We each have resources available to us that other people don't have. You may see the value in it or not. You may think that your particular skill is marketable or not, but God can work a miracle through it. We look at the story of the servants with the talents. Some servants had 10. One servant had 10 talents. One servant only had 1, and yet that servant that only had 1 talent, he didn't really see the value and potential in what he could do with that talent. All he saw was fear. And so he didn't use that talent, that what had been given to him, and he was punished for it. And I think in the same way, because we don't see the value in what we have, we may even be afraid of what we have, or we don't see how God can use it for him. And yet God is saying, I have given this to you because I want you to use it. And so your particular talent may be coupon clipping. How do you have coupons? Coupons? There are people whose entire ministry is clipping coupons and helping the church get the supplies, helping their local church get the supplies that they need, or people in the community get the supplies that they need. I have some friends who are constantly posting pictures on Facebook of, because of my coupons, I was able to buy all of this stuff for like negative $30 or whatever it is. And yet then they can take that stuff that they got these amazing deals on all of these items because they purchased so many of them and they had so many coupons. For some reason today, I just cannot say that word. But yet they were able to use that and donate that stuff to other people in the community who may need help. And so that is a gift that they are using for the kingdom. Your particular gift may be administration, or it may be organization or planning or operations or mathematics. Who would think that God could use mathematics for the kingdom? And yet he can and he has time and time again. It's incredible to see what he can do if we're willing to give him the skills and the abilities that we have. It's amazing to see how he can work miracles through it. One of my best friends is a financial consultant. So she just took a job on staff with her church where her full-time job is to provide financial planning advice to families within the church and families within the community. That is her entire job because she has that knowledge, she has those skills, and yet she wants to use them for the kingdom. And so now she is a full-time staff member at her church because she wants to use that for the kingdom. And so if we're going to accept for ourselves that God is going to be that God can use us and he can use our skills and he can use our abilities, we also, in our relationships with the people around us, we also have to look for their skills and their value. We have to see value in what they have and who they are and who God has created them to be. We have to see like Elisha when he looked at the woman and he saw this little bit of oil. He saw potential in that little bit of oil. And so when we're interacting with people, when we go grocery shopping or when we drop our kids off for school, or if we, so I have an older sister. She's 2 years older than I am, and she's had 2 babies in the last 2 years. My nieces are ages 2 and 1, and they're so cute. And my older niece just had her first dance recital, and the video was absolutely hilarious. I won't put you through watching it because, I'm just a really proud auntie. But even they had this piano recital in the middle of this mall, and my niece was, of course, the one kid that's not paying any attention to the teacher, and she's just doing her own thing, running circles around everybody else who's trying to do the appropriate dance moves. And yet, in those types of situations, that's something in the center of the mall. This was bringing all of these people together to watch these cute little tiny ballerinas attempt to do their little steps. And yet, that could be an opportunity to build relationships with people. If you're a very gregarious person, if you like to talk, that's an awesome opportunity to start meeting new people. And your whole gift, your spiritual gift, could be meeting people in the community and bringing them into church, inviting them into church, and bringing church to them, bringing a relationship to Christ, just living out missionally. It's something we all should be doing, is living missionally, so that when people get to know us, they see what Christ has done through us, and they understand what we talk about when we then try to have a spiritual conversation with them. And so going back to the story of the widow with the oil, the next thing, when I first started working with Convoy of Hope Europe, I moved out there January of 2015. I moved to Brussels, Belgium, January of 2015, and I had a bunch of operational experience, and they were going to use that in the office, and then we received this request that they wanted. CBN Ukraine had sent us a request because there's this war that's been going on in the eastern part of Ukraine between separatist forces who are trying to break off pieces of the country of the eastern part of Ukraine so that they can rejoin the Russian Federation. And Russia is supplying these separatist forces with military weapons and guns and everything that they need to continue fighting with the Ukrainian military, trying to make this split. But in the meantime, there are millions of people in that part of the country who are very happy being a part of Ukraine, who don't necessarily want to leave Ukraine and rejoin Russia. And so the Ukrainian government isn't necessarily happy to let them go. And so there's this full-scale conflict that's been going on since 2014 in the eastern part of the country. So in 2015, CBN, who had been doing their best, their humanitarian arm had been doing their best to respond and provide disaster relief to the people that have been caught in the crossfire, and they finally reached out to us and they said, we really need your help. And so my first trip as a Convoy of Hope staff member was actually into the war zone of eastern Ukraine. And I had to fly into Kiev, and then I took a 6-hour train ride out to Kharkov, and then had to take a 3-hour. We were picked up from the train station, then we had to drive another 3 hours into the war zone. And of course, the roads were a complete mess because of all the tanks that have driven over them with their tracks. And so all the roads are falling apart, and the power keeps cutting in and out because of damage to the power stations. There's no running water in that part of the country, and Ukrainian winters get really cold. And so on that first trip out there, the first night we were in town, the power went out. And since most of the people in that part of the country had no other way to heat their homes, 11 people froze to death just that first night we were in town because of an ice storm that came through in the middle of winter. And so, of course, Convoy of Hope Europe got involved, and we did everything. We started a missionary school to train local Ukrainians who lived in the safe zone, who would volunteer to go into the war zone for 6 months to a year. They would give 6 months to a year of their time to actually move into the war zone and act as our points of humanitarian aid distribution on the ground. And we would distribute everything from wood-burning stoves to generators to loaves of bread, bottles of water, all of the standard humanitarian assistance, plus what they would need to be able to survive the winter. Lots of warm winter clothes for the wood-burning stoves, especially for a lot of the elderly people. We gave them regular deliveries of wood to burn in their wood-burning stoves because just so much of their land had been damaged by the fighting. And so through this effort, through this relief effort, Convoy of Hope and a lot of the other, like the National Church and some of the other humanitarian organizations in Europe, we came together. And through this missionary school that we were able to open, we trained these volunteers who went out and opened 32 missionary centers. And those 32 missionary centers were opened in the cities and towns that were hardest hit by the conflict. And that's where we funneled all of our humanitarian assistance through that. And of course, everything that we do through a local church. So in areas that didn't have a local church, we planted a church. So 10 of those 32 missionary centers actually were church plants, because we want the local church to get the credit for all we do. We don't go in there saying, oh, we're going to put our Convoy of Hope name on this because we're going to be stepping out eventually. We want the church that's there in the community to get all of the credit, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones who are going to be walking with the members of that community through the years and the decades forward. And so through these, when I was talking with my CBN contact a few months ago, we were talking about the impact of these 32 missionary centers that we were opening and all the humanitarian aid that we funneled through them. And, we were talking about how many hundreds of thousands of water bottles, millions of water bottles we distributed, how many loaves of bread, how many generators, how many wood-burning stoves, all of these things. And then we started talking about the spiritual impact. And through this program, through these 32 missionary centers, in 1 year alone, we were able to reach over 500,000 people with the gospel message. Tens of thousands of those people gave their hearts to the Lord. And in 1 year alone, we were able to baptize 4,400 people in the middle of a war zone. And that is, it's amazing to see what God is doing in the middle of the war zone, but God is able to do it because there have been people that are willing to give up, for these volunteers. The only thing that they had to give was their time. They didn't have any extra resources, but they said, we will move into this war zone. We will give our time, we will give our safety to move into this war zone, and we will dedicate this time to serving the Lord and helping our country people in this difficult time. And so they were able to do that. And through those efforts, through their heart, we were able to reach over 500,000 people with the gospel message. And that's absolutely incredible. And so the next thing in reading the story with the widow of the oil, so Elisha says, what do you have? She says, I just have a little bit of oil. And his response to her was, go gather all of the empty jugs from your neighbors. You have to go to your neighbors' houses and knock on the doors, get all of the empty jugs that they have and bring them back to your house and close the door. And so the significant thing about that is, once again, he is not just giving her an easy solution. He's not just writing her a check. He's not just saying, oh, it'll be okay. I'll go talk to those people and they'll forgive your debt. He's not saying any of that stuff. He is getting her involved, this widow. He's getting her and her sons involved in their own solution. But then he's also getting her neighbors involved in her situation. And so she has to go to her neighbors and she has to say, hey, I need all of your empty jugs. I'm really, at that time, she didn't know what God was going to do. But all she had to do was be obedient. So she goes to her neighbors and she says, hey, can you give me any empty glasses or jars or whatever you have laying around the house? And her neighbors had to say yes. Her neighbors could have said, oh, well, I was actually going to, can some tomatoes or, my mom cans applesauce. I'm going to use these to can some applesauce later. But no, they didn't. They saw her situation and they took pity on her and they got involved in helping her help herself. And so when I was reading through this story, it just really struck out to me that everybody has something to contribute. Once again, if you're looking at some of the great moves of God that have happened throughout the Bible, you're not talking about, and then you go to this story and you see these people and their contribution to this great miracle was, oh, well, I just gave her some empty jars that I had laying around. And if you from the outside, if you looked at that, you wouldn't think that that's something significant. And yet her miracle, the amount, the amount of oil that was poured was dependent on the number of jugs that were available. So if there were people, if there had been a neighbor that had hung back and said, I really don't feel comfortable giving you these because I wanted to use them for something else, they have just limited her miracle. But yet the people who said, no, we want to help you, here, take them, they provided an opportunity for God to do even more of a miracle. And so everybody in the community had something that they could contribute to this situation, to this specific situation. And so when we look at community development, and once again, this is just as applicable here in Bellevue as it is in Estonia or in the Bible, but development is a community effort. And your obedience, your participation in helping somebody else out of their problem, your obedience can be somebody else's miracle. And as we go about our day, as we go about our weeks, as we go about, the random people that we bump into at the grocery store or wherever it is, are we looking for ways to be a vessel in which God can work a miracle through their lives? I know I don't always. Most of the time when I go to the grocery store, I don't want to talk to anybody else. I go through the self-checkout, so I don't even have to talk to the cashier. But that's not really how we're supposed to be living. And so I've tried to be a lot more intentional, especially after reading this story about even making sure I go to the checkout line that actually has a cashier, so I can talk to that cashier. And just such a simple thing. In that cashier's life, what if you're the only one coming through that line that asks them how they're doing, or asks them how their kids are doing, or ask them, how their day is going? And so we need to be that example. We need to be that. When I was in Jordan, somebody termed it as a walking Jesus. We were talking about all the refugees that had come through, that were coming through the countries of Jordan and Lebanon. And I was talking with one of the volunteers from the church, and he's like, you know what, these people, they've been through so much. He says the last thing they need is more religion. He says they don't need religion. What they need is a walking Jesus. They need to see who Jesus is in the lives of the people around them, to see the truth in who Jesus is by the way that we are living our lives. Because if someone looks at us and looks at the way that we are living, and they hear us talk about Jesus, but they don't see that truth within how we actually live our life, they're not going to be listening to what's coming out of our mouth. They're listening to and they're watching what we're actually doing. So if we're not living in a way that glorifies God and brings glory to God, then we're doing it wrong. And so another example, when I was anybody here like Pinterest? Yes, okay. I'm obsessed with Pinterest. And so I was working on this project. We had received a request for help from a church out in Russia. In the middle of Russia, there's a church in the city of Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk, if you're not familiar with where it is in Russia, it's the geographic center of the country of Russia. So it's smack dab in the middle of Siberia. And this church, they're a pretty decent sized church, but they had a heart for planting churches in the cities and towns around Novosibirsk, in the suburbs and then a little bit further out. They have an on-site leadership development school, and they are training up pastors to go out and plant churches, which is amazing. But since July of 2016, in July of 2016, the Russian government passed legislation that forbids all religious evangelization whatsoever. It was passed to combat Islamic extremism in the country, but since they couldn't name a specific religion, they just made it against all religions. And so even if you invite somebody into the privacy of your own home, if you try to talk to them about Jesus, you can get fined or arrested or both. And so one of the other things about this legislation is if you've had a church that has been renting a facility, if you don't own your own building, you lose your legal status completely, and you lose all protection you have. And so if you're renting a building, once again, if they catch you trying to preach in your rented building, they can arrest you or throw you in jail. Your only place of safety where you can actually safely share the gospel is within a church building if you own it. And so one of the churches that had been recently planted in the community of Iskatim in Russia, it was about an hour outside of Novosibirsk. They had been renting their building, and so overnight they lost all legal status, all their protection, just as a church. And so they gathered together and they prayed and they fasted for 2 weeks to try to decide what to do, because they didn't have any money. And so when they pooled all the resources that they had, they started looking around town, and the only thing that they could actually afford to buy, literally the only plot of land that they could afford to buy, was just this empty plot. And the reason it was an empty plot that hadn't been developed and it was so affordable was because it was over the ruins of an old former Soviet gulag, where it's estimated that over 250,000 people were killed during Soviet times. And so nobody wanted to build on this land because they thought it was cursed, but this is the only piece of property the church can afford. So I can probably preach a whole message on, just the transformation and what God can do from the ashes of something that was so devastating, how God can build his church. But we'll save that for another day. But all of the financial resources that the people in this church had went into the actual purchase of the property. So once they owned that little plot of land, they had no money to actually build on it. So once again, they prayed and they fasted together. And to me, my favorite part about this story is that at every significant point on this journey, the church members came together and they prayed and they fasted together as a church for 2 weeks before every major decision. And I just love that unity and that heart that they had in coming together. But so after praying and fasting, one of the church members had this idea where if they could go to different construction sites where other buildings had been demolished, they could offer to remove a lot of the debris from these other construction sites. And in removing all the debris from these other construction sites, they were able to to collect any bricks that they could find in the debris that could still be used. And so these recycled bricks are what they use to build the walls of their church. And so if you look at this picture on the left here, you see the different colors in the wall as the building goes up. And that's because those bricks had been recycled from multiple construction sites in the region. And so that kind of ingenuity, and you're talking about, once again, you're talking about the middle of Siberia. And so their winters are very cold, so their walls in some areas have to be a full 3 feet thick. That takes a lot of bricks. And so the walls of the church started to go up, but once they got the walls up, it was about September, and they had to get the roof on, otherwise the snow is supposed to start falling any day. You're talking about the middle of Siberia. The winters start in September. And so they started frantically looking around. They didn't have the resources to put a roof on the building, and they knew if the roof didn't go on the building before the snow started to fall, they were going to be, their construction would come to a complete halt, and they wouldn't be able to start again until the snow melted, which can be May. So you're talking about 6 to 8 months of winter for these people. And so it was a truly desperate situation, because this is all the time that they don't have legal status as a church. And so even trying to gather together as a fellowship and being able to share, just within each other, trying to talk about Jesus, they could all get arrested. And so they asked us to come in, and we're a humanitarian organization, but it's not like we have unlimited resources either. And so we said, we want to help you out, but we just really don't have a lot of money either. Said, we have this one set amount that we can help you in putting the roof on your church, but you're going to have to see what you can do, because we don't have another penny that we can give. And so they looked at a bunch of different construction companies, and all of them were wanting to charge exorbitant prices to get the roof on the church, and none of them wanted to take the commitment of trying to get the roof on before the snow started falling. And so so this church just, once again, they came together and they prayed and they fasted, and they stood on the second level of the church building, and they were standing in a circle holding hands, and they were praying. And the Holy Spirit spoke to the pastor and said, "Look up." And the pastor looks up, and he can look out through one of those windows to the street. And the Holy Spirit says, "See that man walking by in the street? Go talk to him." I mean, just some random guy. Like if you walked out the church doors here and there was some random person walking by. And so the pastor went up to talk to that man. Turns out the man's name was Abraham, and Abraham had his own construction company. And so when the pastor explained their situation with trying to find somebody to put the roof on the church, Abraham told him, "You know what? We are going to do it." And not knowing the number amount that we had said we would do the roof for, he quoted them that exact same number of the amount of money that we had said that we would give towards this project. And so this picture was taken in October. The next month, I went back out for another visit to see. You can see the beams that were starting to go up. You can see Pastor Oleg, who's the one furthest on the left of this picture. He's the pastor of that church. And you can see the beams starting going up, but it was just a full-on race to try to get this roof on before the snow started falling, because it should have started any day. And so that November, and this is why I asked about Pinterest, that November I had made for Thanksgiving in Brussels, Belgium. They don't they don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Europe. That's an American holiday. And so I was the only American in my office. So I had found on Pinterest one of those entire Thanksgiving dinner in a crock pot recipes, where in one crock pot you have the turkey, the stuffing, the potatoes, the green beans, everything, and then you cook it all together. And then I brought it to the office with me and forced it on all my unsuspecting European colleagues. And I don't think they'll ever forgive me, but it wasn't the best. But I remember that very specifically, because after we had our Thanksgiving meal, I went back to my office and I had an email. It was November 28th. I had an email from that pastor, from Pastor Oleg, that said that we were hammering the last tiles in the roof and the snow started falling. And he says the snow started falling. And that night, 24 inches of snow fell across the entire region in Siberia. So God's timing is so perfect. And through this church's efforts, through their A, prayer and fasting, but B, their ingenuity, through the gifts that God had given them, through their relationships with people in the community, we were able to see God work a miracle just in the very walls of this building. And I think this is the most beautiful church that I've ever seen. If you go to the next slide, you can see the finished product. Because everything about this church is a testament to God's provision. The windows were donated, the doors were donated. Somebody even donated heated flooring for the ground floor. And so just every bit of that building is a testament to God's provision, because they got people in the community involved. And then also in the story of the widow with the oil, once they, she had gathered all these jugs, she and her sons went back into the room, they started pouring the oil. The oil didn't run out until all the jugs were full. And then Elisha said to the woman, he didn't say, okay, sell this, you're on your own. He said, take what you have, sell it, pay off your debt, and he said, you and your sons live on the rest. So this wasn't a short-term solution. This miracle that God had worked was not enough to just get them out of debt, but it was enough to set them up for the rest of their lives. Not just this old woman's life, but her and her sons to be able to live off of for the rest of their lives. And so God's provision is not just for tomorrow, but it's for a lifetime. And for most of the people that we interact with on a daily basis, and most of the people that we need to be having these conversations with, and we need to be seeing the value in who they are and what they have, and just looking for the ways where we as a community can come around them and help, and help them to be open for God to work a miracle in their life. We're not looking for short-term solutions. We're looking for long-term solutions. And for so many of them, that long-term piece comes in the spiritual component. Are we putting people in a place where they can have a spiritual relationship with Christ, where God can really transform their lives? And so that's what I'm excited to go into in Estonia. I came into missions because I was listening to a missionary that had come to my church in Cincinnati and spoke, and he used a quote by D.L. Moody that said, "My greatest fear is not that I'll fail, but that I'll succeed in something that doesn't matter." And that hit me like a lightning bolt to my chest, because up to that point, I thought I was going to be the American ambassador to Russia. That was my dream. From the time I was a little girl, I got my bachelor's degree in history and Russian studies. I did a semester abroad in Russia. I got my master's degree in public policy and national security. I wrote my master's thesis on Russian weapons of mass destruction, arms control policy, which fits right into missions. But that just shows you my life was going in a very specific direction. I had very specific ambitions for myself. But when I heard that quote, I just realized, if I'm going to go do this, even if I become the American ambassador to Russia someday, it's a politically appointed position. So even if I was able to get that appointment, in the end, what does that really matter? Like, what contribution have I really made for Christ and for the kingdom? And so that's when I had to reevaluate my situation and my life choices. And so when the missionary that had been speaking at my church, who used that quote by D.L. Moody, his name was Michael McAnamy. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him before, but he was the president and CEO of Convoy of Hope Europe. And so after the service, he and I talked, and he invited me to come work with him in Belgium. And on the next slide, you can see a picture of our team there. That was our whole team. Doesn't look like many people, and yet this small team was in charge of running program activity in 48 countries across Europe and Eurasia. We were able to plant almost 50 churches over 10 years. We were able to see how these community development principles apply in so many different cultures, and it was just incredible to see how God was working. You have these countries that are right next to each other. They're maybe 5 hours apart, and yet their language is completely different. Their culture is completely different. Everything about them is completely different. And so just finding ways in each community to make, where God shows himself, where he makes himself relevant in each culture. And that's, that was the miracle of what we saw every day. What we were able to see and be a part of was just seeing how God relates to people where they are on the level that they're in, and how his transforming power can change entire communities. And so when last fall, I was fully appointed as a missionary. And then this past May, I was ordained as a minister. And that was very special to me. But in praying for this next step of ministry, I was praying to God, do I go back to Europe? What do I do? And I just really felt like God was telling me I had unfinished business in Eurasia Northwest, and specifically in the country of Estonia, where their national religion, in Europe in general, we've been seeing the rise of secularism, but in Estonia specifically, they've taken that to a new level by declaring atheism as their national religion. Only 16%, 1/6 of the people in the country declare any religious affiliation whatsoever. That's Muslim, Buddhist, Catholic, everything. The evangelical Christians, there's less than 5% of the country are evangelical Christians. And if you look at the Russian-speaking minority, which is the group I'm going to be working with specifically, there, that number is even smaller. Some places will say less than 1%, some places will say up to 3%, so I averaged those together and I put 2. And so when I was talking, I was asked to join a church planting team in Estonia, and I told the leader, my new boss, and I said, okay, well, I'll go, but just so you know, my heart is for reaching the Russian speakers, this Russian-speaking minority, and so it's really important that I continue to study the Russian language. And he said, oh, that's perfect, because this church plant that we're doing is right on the neighborhood of the largest Russian-speaking population in the city of Tallinn. And I was like, well, God is amazing, and that is awesome, because that's exactly, what I had been hoping to do. And so over this term, it's a 3-year term. The countries of Eurasia Northwest, we're going to be working throughout. I'm going to be based in Tallinn, going to be working with this church plant in Tallinn, but then also continuing to work on some of the community development projects that we had going on through Eurasia Northwest, which is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia. And once again, many of those countries I had already been working in, but our goal is to train church planters across Eurasia Northwest on church-led community development and to partner with the national churches to see that 500 churches are planted in those countries. More than half of those will be in Ukraine alone. And we've already seen how God can work in those situations. So thank you so much that you guys, that Hope Church has been willing to partner with me on this journey. I'm so grateful for you and for the opportunity to share with you this morning.